afternoon, E39 source. My name's Geoff, and here today is my 2001 BMW E39 M5. June marks the 4th year I've owned this car, so I figured I'd share with you guys some of the updates I've made to it, some of the struggles I've had while owning it, and some of the joys. And hopefully, you guys can get a better picture of what it's like to own one of these cars for a number of years. So first things first, obviously this is a titanium silver car, model year 2001. I'm the third owner, and this car was originally from Connecticut. I suspect it was probably some Wall Street guy's car. That's my theory, at least. But what's interesting about it is it has virtually zero options other than the telephone, which you can tell right here with the little antenna. But other than that, it's a sport extended leather car and nothing else. Starting with an exterior update to the car, not much has changed overall. I've kept the car mostly looking OEM with a few slight upgrades and modifications here and there. The paint is obviously titanium silver, but it's uncorrected. This is original paint except for the front bumper, which I had repainted at some point. But the paint is overall in really good condition, and one of the really nice things about owning a titanium silver car is that the swirls don't show up at all, even in the sun. So this makes it really easy to live with this car on a day-to-day basis. Some of the changes you'll notice is I have the brake ducts or sink drains as some people call them in the front there. I also have the Euro spec headlights, and I put in a new set of Style 65 genuine wheels. This car, when I originally bought it, had replicas. The replicas were so badly designed that it actually broke the front shocks. They actually tore into them. So I needed to get a real set of Style 65s because they look so right on this car. But other than that, most of the plastic trim is all original to the car. Driver's side door mirrors, all original. Really the only thing that I've modified here on the back is the M badge. I put a high contrast M badge there. Makes the color pop a little bit more. One thing I briefly forgot to mention is if you watched my first introduction video, these rocker panels were destroyed and I had them fixed up. They were starting to rust pretty bad, but the guy I got him to did a really good job, and now they're mostly really clean. I also got the rubber jack pads under there and replaced some of the plastic trim underneath the car. So now it's situated pretty right, and I'm not too worried about the chassis getting too much rust on it. There are obviously a few places where these cars tend to rust, and I'm no exception. I've got a little rust bubble there on the trunk and a little bit in the gas cap here. Thankfully the rust here hasn't spread too much, and it's probably one of the things I'm going to address fairly soon. But overall, the exterior of this car I'd say is in really good condition. Rubbers haven't perished, except for the windshield trim. I'll have to replace that too. But every time I open up the garage to look at this car, it's just blows me away that I own one of these things. And that's really something that's grown on me over the 4 years of owning this car, is that the beauty really hasn't faded on it. And that's something very few cars I think are capable of doing. Even after coming out and driving this thing nearly 35,000 miles, it still feels like a new car to me every time I open the garage. And I can't say there are many cars that give that same feeling. Moving on to the interior, I'll show you guys what it looks like inside. Not much has changed since you last saw it over the 4 years I've had it. I upgraded the pedals to M Performance pedals. I put in the Euro dash, which I really like because it gives the passenger more leg room, and the Titan line lines up nicer too. It was obviously the way this car meant to come. But other than that, most of the stuff you see in this car is original. The shift knob too I changed out. But the seats, the armrests, the handbrake, the door cards, all of that's original. One of the things I've spent the most time doing with this interior is just maintaining it and cleaning it, especially the leather. The products that I use are Leatherique to clean and condition the leather. I do that biannually, and what that does is it leaves a really nice matte finish, which is something that I've come to really care about for some reason. It's kind of a strange thing, but what it does is that when you do the process right, the seats end up looking like they're brand new again. and something about this car just encourages you to make it look like it's brand new again. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. And then once I've done a leather wreak process, I use Swiss Wax to condition it. Basically what that does, it kind of seals in the work that you put in, leaves a protective layer, at least that's what they say. But overall, I'm really pleased with the results and what they give. One thing I should mention is that leather wreak is a widely touted product, but it's not all that easy to use, and there's actually kind of a trick to it, so let me go through that real quick. One of the first things you got to realize about this car in particular is that these trims are sensitive to the oil that leather wreak uses. So if you get any of it on the trim, it will chip it away, and that can be a bad day, especially with these trims approaching four-figure sums. So don't do that. If you get any of the oil on here, if it splatters, make sure you get it off. Another thing too is that leather wreak only works in the heat. So you really can only use it in the summer when you've got the sun out, hopefully all day. I tried doing it in the winter once and it didn't do anything. So that's something to keep in mind. And really the last thing too is when you're getting the oil off the surface, you have to use a light brush to scrub it off. If you don't do that, the oil sticks and it leaves this kind of sticky residue and it doesn't give you the finish that you want. So those are really the key things I would say if you do the process yourself. It's time consuming, but it's definitely worth it, and it shows. Because I feel like this interior is better looking than it ever was, other than when it was new, obviously. But it really restored a lot of what it used to look like. Looking at the gauge cluster here, sitting at 91,000 miles. So I've put approximately 30,000 miles on this car since owning it. I bought it with 65 back in 2016. And overall, every single one of those miles has been really enjoyable. This is one of those cars you just can't really get enough of when you drive it. You never really want to get out of it, especially with the work I put in to make this interior as new as I can. It's really a nice place to be. One thing I should also mention, which was a huge upgrade, was doing the BAV sound speaker upgrade. And what that does is it replaces your tweeters, which are here. It then replaces your mid-range subs here. And then it also replaces your speakers in the rear passenger doors, and it also replaces the speakers back here behind the parcel shelf. It's a DIY. It's a job you can do it yourself. It takes a little bit of time to do it, but it's otherwise plug and play, and it made a huge difference over the stock speakers which come with this car. Now I should mention this was not M Audio. If you have an M Audio car, they actually recommend to not replace the speakers because they're already really high quality. But the regular hi-fi speakers have paper cones, and they're just a little, they're just cheaper made. Whereas your BAV sound ones are really nice Kevlar cones. They're made with proper aluminum baffling and so forth. They're really, really well made. And it was about, I think, a $300 package, and it made, I'd say, a $3,000 difference in the experience of this car. And combine that with the Blue Bus Bluetooth audio streaming device, which is now available, it has made this car like a new car again. It's probably one of the biggest upgrades I've made in terms of quality of life. I couldn't recommend it enough. So yeah, those are really some of the big things I've changed with this interior. Figured I'd quickly show you the rear here. Not an awful lot to see, other than it's overall pretty clean. It's got the fat fold-down rest, which I really like. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of the car. One thing I should also mention is that the Eurodash, because the front seats now have more legroom, someone who's over 6 feet tall can actually sit back here pretty comfortably. And because these seats are non-split folds, they're sunk in a little bit, so they're actually really comfortable to sit in. I also put the rear cup holders back here. They're just as flimsy as the ones in the front, so I recommend you don't use them, but they're there in case you ever need them. Moving on to the trunk, kind of same story there. I got the M5 matte. This is not OEM, so this is actually a guy from the owners group designed these and had them made, and these are really, really nice. If you can get your hands on one, I definitely recommend it. In here is where I keep the Blue Bus. So right now it's flopping around. I need to figure out a way to fasten it, but this is what I mentioned earlier. This is $200 and a $2,000 upgrade to the car. Easily one of the best things I've done for it. Also got some oil pouches back here. Definitely going to need those. And I replaced some of the trunk tools. Here. I don't have the European tools. I don't know where you'd find them, but it's nice having the towing high again, because that was missing when I got the car. Who knows when I'll need that again. Hopefully not soon, but you never know. But yeah, that about does it for the interior of the car. Overall, probably one of my favorite aspects of owning this car. One of the nicest places to be. Now for probably the biggest change to this car since you last saw it, and that would be the engine. So let's open this up here. And there it is, S62. So the engine you're looking at here is not the same engine you saw 4 years ago. This is a rebuilt motor, and it's kind of a long story. Basically, the long and the short of it is about 2 years into owning this car, I noticed a tick at about 2,000 RPM. I originally thought it was rod knock. So I got an oil sample done, and they found high contents of aluminum. And at first I thought it was a lifter, so I took it to a mechanic, they checked it out. They thought, it's probably not the rod bearings, because they listened to them. So they went ahead and changed out the lifters and didn't change the noise. The noise was getting worse and worse. See if I can insert a clip here real quick so you can hear it. The noise was really bad, so something had to be done. And because it wasn't clear what the problem was, and since it sounded like it was about to blow up, we decided to take the engine out and tear it apart. And what we saw inside was pretty shocking. The bores were really scored up, the pistons were practically destroyed. It was almost like glacial grooves were carved out into the driver's side cylinders. And basically the working theory is that at some point in this car's life, before I owned it, it was dry started. And when I went through the Carfax, I noticed that this car sat on a dealer's lot for about 6 years and maybe about 10 miles put on it. So my best guess is that in that time, this car sat for a very, very long time. And when a car sits that long, the oil drains out of all your nooks and crannies and probably left this car high and dry. And it was obviously started by someone. And by doing that, they created a small scoring and gap in the cylinders, and over time what happened was the piston started slapping against the side, and it just got worse and worse, and it was only a matter of time before the engine was going to self-implode. So I organized to get a rebuild done of it, and it was really bad because the first guy who agreed to do it really screwed me over. He spent about a year and a half sort of stringing me along, doing little bits and bobs. He kept assuring me that he could do the job, but he obviously couldn't. And that's one thing you should know about these engines, is they're really not, you can do a lot yourself, like top end work and stuff, but the really heavy stuff like timing the motor and bottom end work is really left to someone who has experience with them from before. But anyway, I found a guy who was able to do it for me. His name is Mikhail Epilev. He's well known on the owners group, and he did a fantastic job turning this engine around for me and had it rebuilt for me within a matter of 2 months. And at a very, very, what I would consider a very reasonable labor rate. So after I got the engine back in the car, it ran like a top. And right now it's sitting at about 5,000 to 6,000 miles on the new motor. And I couldn't be happier with it. It's super smooth, burns zero oil. Overall in really, really good condition. I also detailed this engine bay, tried to clean some of this stuff up. The main thing is that this engine is like brand new again. And it's really nice to know that I have the ability to drive many, many more miles unfettered. So that's really reassuring. And I know the other key thing is you don't know what your ownership past is like when you buy one of these cars. You know, someone might have taken really good care of it, or someone might have really abused it. So having the ability to warm it up on my own terms, putting in the right oil, making sure it's at the right levels, that's all really key stuff. So I'm really glad about that. And with the amount of money I've sunk into this, I certainly don't plan on selling it anytime soon. One of the last things I'll mention about this car is some of the upgrades I've done for it in terms of the performance. So obviously I did these upgrades before the engine started giving me problems because I thought the engine was running just fine. And I actually I took it to a dynamometer. It put 345 wheel horsepower down before I did any of these mods. So it was running really strong. Rumor has it that an engine runs at its strongest before it blows up, but that's another story. But basically, the intakes you see here are Evolve Alpha N intakes. So back in 2017, Evolve had a really awesome group buy where you could buy the Evolve intakes, the Evolve tune, and the Evolve headers all in one for about 20-something $100. And it was a deal I couldn't pass up. So I went ahead and did that. And what that does is the headers open up the top end of this motor a lot. It gives you about 30 horsepower past 5,000 RPM. The intakes add to that probably another 10 horsepower, and then the tune's probably another 20. So overall, this engine's probably making on the order of 450 horsepower. The biggest difference in power that you feel is really all on the top end. Whereas before, these motors tend to start to run out of breath around 5,000. Now it feels like a screamer motor that really, it sort of hits a resonance in the top end revs. And combine that with this motor's really good low end torque, you have a really, really well balanced powertrain that covers pretty much all driving situations, whether that be just going around town or highway overtaking or even drag racing. The sound this thing makes all the way to redline it's something biblical. If there's enough interest, I'll actually include a separate clip which gives all the sounds this thing makes, which are really awesome. But yeah, some of the other performance upgrades I've done include the suspension. So you might have noticed that the stance of this car is not exactly stock, and that's because I'm running a Dynon Stage 2 suspension. So what that is it's running Koni shocks, which have adjustable dampers, Dynon springs, which lower the ride height by ever so slightly. It lowers the front by like half an inch and the rear by like a quarter of an inch. And then I have a Dynon rear sway bar in the rear. And what this did is it A, replaced the shocks which had been really worn on my car, and B, gave it just a little bit of a stiffer ride, but not so stiff that it's uncomfortable. This car is actually still very supple, especially around the bumps. So I installed the suspension myself. Would I do it again? Probably not. It was one of the hardest things I ever did. And I did it on jack stands. I do not recommend doing that job on jack stands. But I'm really glad I did it in the long run. It's one of my favorite upgrades. Made the handling of the car a lot better. You can't really see it. Another upgrade I did was the differential. Let me see if I can get down here. You can see it. Can't really see it here from here, but I swapped in a 345 rear end. So this car comes stock with a 315 rear end. The 345, what that does is gives you a 10% boost in torque in all gears at the sacrifice of higher RPMs. So basically around town in second and third gear, this thing's got some serious grunt when you combine that with the powertrain upgrades I did. But the sacrifice is that on cruising speeds at about 80 miles an hour, you're sitting at about 3,000 RPM cruising RPMs. Naturally, as a result of higher cruising RPMs, I probably get slightly worse gas mileage than I would have. Even despite all this, I get about 18 miles per gallon mixed driving that includes highway and city, which, to be perfectly honest, is not bad for a car that offers this much performance. And if I'm doing pure highway driving, I can probably squeeze 22 to 23 miles per gallon at about 75 miles an hour. So this car is really well equipped to do a road trip. One of the last upgrades I did was the Eisenman Race mufflers, which is kind of the cherry on top for this whole system. And man, these things are something special. They really make the engine sound exotic, but not unrefined. Because one of the key things about this car is how smooth it is and how relaxed and comfortable it is. So you want a car that when you put the windows up, you turn up the music, it's super comfortable, you don't really hear the exhaust, there's no drone. But then when you put the windows down, it's a screamer, it's like an exotic V8. And I'm really happy with the system I have because it gives the best of both worlds. So to wrap this video up, I think I'll just give a few final thoughts. So I've owned this car 4 years, and without a doubt, it's put me through a lot. I've had to put a new engine in it, a new suspension in it, and there's still stuff that I have to fix. Mostly minor, thankfully, nothing too bad, but just a couple drivetrain things here and there. But despite all that, I still own it. And the reason is because this car offers something that really no other car in its class does. It's a luxurious four-door car with a stick shift and a naturally aspirated V8. There just simply aren't that many cars out there that offer that. Some of you might be wondering just how much money I've got invested in this car over the years. And suffice it to say, it's a decent amount of money. I have in this car about what you'd get for, say, a 30 to 40,000 mile F10 M5 that's pre-facelift. The question is would I rather have this car than an F10 M5, which is newer, faster, turbocharged, modern, etc.? And the answer is I'd take this car any day of the week. The reason is this car is the quintessential BMW M5. I've driven other ones, I've looked at other ones, and they're really nice cars. But for me, this is the one. This is the one to have. This is the one to keep. This is the one to maintain long term. There's just something about it. And even though it's pretty much given me every single problem you can imagine, I've been able to put up with it and still love it, even to this day. And in fact, after I'm done with this video, I can't wait to go and take it for a drive. So, thanks for watching. Hope you guys learned something useful about this car. If you're thinking about buying one, I definitely recommend it. There's a lot of fun to be had with these things. Just be careful. They can bite you in the ass. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, you're owning something really special. And for me, I wouldn't have it any other way.